Thank you guys so much for having me here, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here with you guys. Tonight, we're going to be talking about product photography, which I know is something that can be intimidating to some TPT authors. I've worked with a lot of them, and we're going to talk first about why it matters, why this is so important to your store. And then we're going to dig into 3 ways to take brighter, better photos. And I'm just going to share 3 of my most simple, but like highly effective tips that you can start trying right away that will make a huge difference when it comes to taking bright photos. And before I introduce myself and tell you a little bit about myself, just know I will not, please like stop me anytime if you have a question. If you, even if you just like unmute and yell at me, I'm totally fine with that. So I am not formal at all. So I'm Rakel, like I said. I was a K through 2 teacher for 10 years, and I left the classroom after I had my second kiddo. I started my product photography business like the last year I was teaching. And so I've been doing product photography and videography for teacher authors since 2021. And about 2 years ago is when I noticed there was a big need for teacher authors who couldn't necessarily they didn't necessarily need to hire out for product photography, or they couldn't afford that in their business, but they wanted to learn how. And so that's kind of how I got into this niche of coaching photography. And also I have a product photo course called Product Photo Genius, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. But first, I really want to dig into why that's so important. So that'll be kind of the first chunk of our session today. And then the second part, we're going to talk about 3 easy ways to take better, brighter photos. And so when we talk about why product photography matters, the first thing I want you to do is kind of this super short exercise with me, because sometimes seeing things demonstrated is a little bit easier than just me telling you. And so I want you to go on this really fun shopping spree with me and ask yourself if you would be more likely to click on a listing from store A or store B. And in a moment, I will show you both stores. So just take a moment to peek at the listings and see what you'd be more likely to click on if you were shopping. So here's store A. And I'll give you a hint, everything about these listings will be exactly the same, except for the image that is used to portray the listing. Okay, and here is store B. And so here's a comparison of the 2 of them. If you want to type it in the chat for fun, which store would you be more likely to buy if you were looking for a new desk? Which store would you be more likely to click on a listing from? Okay, Chris says B. It's like Joan says B, Lynette says B, B. Okay, I'm glad you guys all said B and didn't all say A, because then I wouldn't really know what to say. But anyone want to be brave and willing to share why they said B? And it's okay if you don't want to either.
Go ahead, Lynette.
I was just gonna say I like to see, because I mean there's a lot of it's very visual, as what Laura has mentioned. Like it's nice to see what it looks like, because it could be anything when it's this modern desk with drawers.
Absolutely. It's really nice to see a picture of what you're actually getting. I 100% agree. And although these are desks, not printable resources, I find that, and many people that are using product photos find the same thing, that people really want to see an image of a product in action. They want to see what they're getting. And that first impression, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is so key to building trust with your buyers. Because if you have taken the time to create a cover that has a real photo of your product, they're able to see what they're getting. that instantly helps create trust in your brand. Like you care enough and put enough effort into your products that you have these professional photos. Like, why wouldn't your product be just amazing? And it's just that first impression that really starts to build that trust with your brand. Okay, hang on. I'm gonna X out of the meeting chat here. There we go. Okay, so this is kind of just a big list. And I'll dig a little bit more deeply into some of these reasons, but why a lot of people wonder, why do you actually need visuals to sell your products? And here is just kind of a couple things that high quality product images or even using mock-ups in some cases can help you do. They can lead to a higher click-through rate. They offer that visual appeal. They build that trust and credibility. They can help you increase your conversion rates. They really allow that buyer to visualize your resource in action or in use, picturing what it might look like being used by students in a classroom. And they also allow you to highlight unique aspects pretty efficiently. So a photo can convey a lot of information just by looking at it, whereas someone might have to read a lot more words in order to get that same information, but they can immediately see what your resource is about just by glancing at a photo. And so we're going to dig into a couple of these reasons a little bit more in depth. And one of the reasons that photos are so helpful with your product listings is because they can help you get more clicks on that listing. So as you know, when you're scrolling TpT, the first thing that people are going to see is that cover. And using that attractive, high quality image helps you stand out. And what that leads to is when they see an image that looks professional, looks like a product, they're like, hey, like I could see my kids potentially using this in the classroom. That might lead to that stopping of the scroll. And that's when they're going to say, hey, I'm going to read maybe your title and read your snippet in order to decide if they're going to click on your listing. So it's not just the image that's important. It's just the image that's going to get your customer to stop scrolling for a second and actually consume the other parts of your listing. And so we're hoping that once they stop, they see your photo, your title, and your snippet, that's going to lead to a click through. And sorry, if you can hear my furnace running next to me, we moved this summer. Okay, good. We moved this summer and I used to have this lovely above garage office and now I work in my basement until we're able to finish the basement. So it's kind of loud down here. But hopefully that leads to a click through. And once your buyer clicks through to your listing or your potential buyer, then they're able to see all of the parts of your listing, including your other images, your preview, which is hopefully going to lead to more sales, more reviews. Ideally, that would lead to better rankings in search. I can't promise that because if I knew the mysteries of the TpT search algorithm, I would probably make a lot more money than I do right now. But ideally, that's what that would lead to, which would lead to more sales, more cash flow in your business. Hang on, I don't know why my mouse is being so goofy here tonight. Okay, so here's what else we know. We know that your audience prefers visuals. We know some facts about humans. We know that humans process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. We know that posts with visuals receive up to 94% more views if you're comparing to posts without visuals. And there's also a statistic that 67% of e-commerce consumers say that the quality of a product image is very important in selecting and purchasing a product. And you can relate that to yourself as a consumer. I know when I'm scrolling on Etsy or Amazon or Google Shopping, the first thing that I really pay attention to is that image. And that's what gets me interested in the rest of the product listing. And if that image isn't good or it's non-existent, I'm probably not even going to pay attention to that product at all. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier too about those first impressions, and you really only get one chance to make that first impression. And the human brain, we know, forms its first impression in about 50 milliseconds, which is very quickly. And being able to see a product photo of your resource is going to build a first impression that helps build trust with your brand. They're like, hey, this person really took the time to put effort into what this cover looks like, into showing me what their product is and their resource includes. And they're going to be more interested in viewing the rest of your product or the rest of the details. And often I like to think about just myself as a consumer and kind of asking yourself what your purchasing habits are, or if you put yourself in the shoes of your potential buyers, like when you're scrolling, what causes you to stop and take a second look, or what you're looking for in a listing is often what your potential buyers are looking for as well. And so sometimes it just helps to put yourself in the place of your potential buyers. Okay. And so what all of this leads to is once you recognize how important product photos are for your business and how important visuals are as a part of your marketing strategy, it kind of leads to a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation. And maybe some of you have been there before. So you're in this place where you're like, yes, I recognize how important visuals are in my business, and I need quality images to optimize my listings. And in order to increase my conversion rates and in order to increase the amount of money I'm making, but now I need more money in order to actually afford to hire someone to achieve those images. And it's almost like what comes first? How do you do both at the same time? Because hiring a product photographer, I do product photography for people, and like it isn't necessarily an inexpensive service. It's something that takes a lot of time and effort and can cost a lot of money if you're hiring it out consistently for all of your products. And so that is kind of where I came in. And that is actually why I created my course, Product Photo Genius. And I really just saw this missing piece in the TpT space where people wanted to DIY their photos or they wanted to learn how, and it was just didn't seem very feasible because there weren't a lot of good resources. So I created the course that I wish existed when I was teaching myself to take product photos, because I was a second grade teacher. I was not like a professional photographer in a previous life. I took blurry pictures of my kids and pets was about my experience when I started learning how to take product photos. And I can tell you, I scoured the internet for months. It probably took me over a year before I actually refined my process and figured out exactly the exact editing tools that I like to use and how I do it. And so that was kind of how my course came into existence, is I just wanted to share with other TpT authors that they can take photos and it doesn't have to be as complicated as you might think. So sorry, Chris, I do not use a DSLR. I actually show you in my course how to use your phone. I don't use Photoshop, and I show you how to use a couple different editing tools, one of them being a completely free app. And I'll also show you later when I'm showing you my brightness options. One of the things that I use, I make a DIY light box out of, I literally use, I will show you in my studio later, um, foam boards from the Dollar Tree. And that is how I take all of my photos. So you may think like I have this huge, really fancy studio, but it is so achievable for any teacher author. And just because I am so proud of them and want you to see, these photos were all taken by students that have taken Product Photo Genius and learned how to take product photography from me. And there are so many teacher authors now that are just totally crushing it with their product photos because it's not as hard as you might think. So, and I can definitely throw the link in the chat for that later as well if anybody is interested in learning more about that. But what I want to dig into next is just 3 simple ways to take better, brighter images. And the reason I decided to focus on this is because this is probably the #1 question I get asked. People say, my photos are dark, they're shadowy, they're not bright, they're not white. And I'm not going to tell you that there's not some editing involved, because yes, there's editing involved to get that beautiful bright white, but you can get a much brighter photo just by doing a couple super simple things. So first, We're going to talk tonight about making and using a DIY light box. Then we're going to talk about increasing the exposure manually before you take images. And last, we're going to talk about lighting and how important it is to get even and consistent lighting, which is like the key to getting good photos. So some of you might be wondering, what in the world is a light box, Rakel? Here are some pictures of some lovely light boxes. And the reason I have a circle and a check mark around the one on the left is because this is my lovely DIY light box invention made out of literal foam boards from the Dollar Tree. And the reason there's a check mark is because I highly prefer my DIY light box over the pre-made light boxes that you can buy on Amazon. Not only are they way cheaper, but there are a lot of benefits to creating your own. And so here are just some things that a light box can do for you. First of all, what it's intended to do is the light bounces or reflects off of the walls, which helps if you're using like artificial lighting, it helps contain that lighting within the box and helps create a brighter environment when you're photographing. It also helps to control or block the external light. So I know I have some terrible LED lighting in this basement of mine now, and they are completely the wrong temperature. They're way too warm. But when I'm using my light box, it almost like blocks that external light and just keeps the artificial lighting that I'm using inside that box. It's also really inexpensive to build your own. I mean, I think it's $1.25 at the Dollar Tree now, and I use 3 boards and some tape. So it's less than $5 to build your own light box. And you also just have a lot more flexibility. So the reason I like it so much better than the light boxes that you would purchase on Amazon are because often with the ones on Amazon, a lot of them are like 12 inches or 18 inches, but the walls don't move. So when you're taking TpT product photos and you want to push like a pile of notebooks kind of hanging out of the side, or maybe your product uses some scissors or some markers and they're kind of hanging out off the side, there's not really room to do that with those because the walls don't move. And so I'll show you in a minute. I'm going to show you how I actually make them. And I have it taped on 2 sides. And so I'm constantly moving my walls in and out. I lift up the walls if I need to shove a stack of notebooks under there. It works so much better. But also, a lot of times those light boxes from Amazon, they have the lights built in, and that gives you a little less control over your lighting because if you have, let's say, like a reflective object in your photo and you want to move your light so that it's not reflecting in that object, you don't really have the ability to do that. You're kind of just stuck where the lights are. So, hang on, let me find my arrows. I don't know why my arrow keys aren't working today. So for my first tip, I'm going to show you how to build a light box. And here are the things you need. You need 3 foam boards and some tape. And I just say make sure that it's the foam core and not the poster board. So the thinner poster board has a little bit of reflection to it. And also it's really thin and flimsy, so it doesn't stand up as much. Where that foam core board, it's maybe about 1/2 inch, 1/4 of an inch thick. It just has a little bit more sturdiness to actually stand up. And so, like I said, I get mine from the Dollar Tree, but you can also order foam core board on Amazon. You can get it at Walmart, probably at Target. So it's everywhere. And then I'm going to show you. So sometimes I like to hop on my phone and I'll try and move my computer in a little bit, but I feel like sometimes when I try to hop on my phone in meetings to show you my studio, then some weird tech glitch happens. So I tried to put everything just like on my computer tonight so tech will work on my side. So I start with one board and this is like the back wall. And then I add another board on the side and a third board. And so what this creates is almost like a box that has 3 sides, and where I'm standing to take the photographs is that 4th side. And then I add some tape to where the boards meet. And that is literally how I make a light box. It is very quick and very simple. And as you can see, since it's only taped where those boards meet. It hinges so I can move the boards out or in. If I need like something to be brighter, I can move the boards closer together. I can push them further away if I need more room for something. And so, ta-da, here is what mine currently looks like. And the other really awesome thing about foam is you can cut it, you can push things through it. So you can see I have some of my lights currently up on this top left picture. You can see I have them actually being like held up. I shoved them through the foam. You can see in this top right corner, I have a piece of my foam board cut out because I like to pull my overhead phone holder for when I take video. I like to pull it into the boards and have it be closer to my surface. So I just cut out a nice hole for it, which is the nice thing about building a light box. Okay, so before I move on to increasing exposure, I'll stop here and see if anybody has any questions about building a light box before I move on to my next tip.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems like in your picture, the duct tape is on the inside of the box as opposed to the outside, but that doesn't mess up the picture?
Well, I'll tell you, Chris, mine have been taped. So these boards, like they're really old. Mine have been taped a ton of times. So let me look at my current one. My current one has tape on both sides right now to hold it up because it was starting to fall down. Because you can see how I pushed my lights through the backside. So
Mm-hmm.
those lights are kind of heavy, but the stands were getting in the way of my lights being close enough. So because they're pushed through my board, I taped on both sides just to make it like sturdier. But no, the tape doesn't affect the photo at all. And in my current light box, you can see at the bottom, that's just bulletin border that I had at the bottom too. Sometimes I'll take photos where like something is standing upright, and I want to have a border across the bottom so it looks like it's a flat surface with like a wall behind it. And the way to kind of cover up that crease is with bulletin border, once I like push it flat together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but the tape doesn't bug the picture at all. And I use white tape. I don't really know where I ordered it. I ordered it on Amazon somewhere. So I have it right here. YYX Life is the brand, but it's just white tape I used. And I like to use it for other things too if I do need tape in my photo shoots at all, because when I edit, that white tape doesn't show up at all. Okay, so I will move on to tip number 2, which is increasing exposure. And this is probably the easiest thing you can do, but the people that I've worked with, they're like, this is the simplest thing, but it makes the biggest difference in my photos. So, number one, if you have edited photos before, you know that you can increase the exposure in editing after you take the image. Often what happens with TpT photos is that you're wanting to get it so bright so that background's really white, but then those colors start to get overexposed. They start to kind of like blend in, not look great. So if you actually increase the exposure manually, which I'm going to show you how to do on an iPhone and Android, you can increase it before you photograph, and that instantly is going to help your photos look brighter and whiter, but it's also going to make it less work for you afterwards in editing to play around with getting those bright whites. And so let me just show you an example. Here are two photos, and these are two different photos. The one on the left was taken using the one on the left was taken without my light box and without increasing the exposure. I changed absolutely nothing else besides I put my light box back and increased the exposure, and that's the difference in the right-hand photo. And so as you can see, like it's not perfect yet. It's still going to need some editing, but it's a lot closer to that bright white from the starting place. And so that is just using the two tips that I am showing you. Okay, so before I move to that video, This is when I would usually switch to my phone and show you how, but I recorded it and put it on my phone in a video in the presentation so that something goofy doesn't happen when I try to switch to a different device. But this one is kind of shaky. I don't know what was going on, but so don't mind the shakiness. But this is going to be the next one. I'm going to kind of walk you through how to increase the exposure manually using an iPhone. And then after that, I will show you an Android. And so here's your iPhone screen. I have it over my photos. The first way that I'm doing right here, you can see on the left-hand side that little sun. So when you have your camera open, if you touch an object on your screen, you'll see that little slider with the sun pop up. If you adjust that and either raise it higher, it will increase exposure, or if you lower it, it will decrease exposure. This is not my favorite way to do it, but that is one way that you can manually do it. Here's the way that I like better. So the next way I'll show you on screen is you're going to pull up. So you have that little arrow. It's like this little yellow arrow at the top. You can either click that or you can just use your finger to pull up on your screen. And you'll get this menu down at the bottom of different options. And the one you're going to click on, I'll circle it here in my video in a second, but it's this little plus and minus inside the circle. And once you click on that plus and minus, it will open up, and I'm sorry that it's upside down. It will open up to this exposure menu. And so what you can do is drag your finger left and right to decrease or increase exposure. And I like this a little bit better because it gives you just a little bit more control about how specific you want to be. And so you can see this is like all the way decreased, as dark as it can be. And then you'll see it get brighter as I increase. For my lighting and environment, I typically stop about right here at plus 1.0. Depending on your lighting and like your environment, because if you're not using the same lights as me, it might look a little bit different. Typically what I say is to increase the exposure until you start to see any colors in your photo change. If you start to see like the colors of your paper starting to get washed out, then I back up into the last place that they looked the same. And so I just say to increase until stop before you start to see those colors change. And for me, that's about plus 1.0. Some people like to increase it a little bit higher before they take photos. Some people maybe like to do a little bit less, and that's kind of personal preference or what looks best in your kind of environment. Excuse me. Okay, so that's on an iPhone. Two different ways. You can either touch the screen and that little sun will pop up, or you can pull up to show your menu and click that little plus or minus in order to adjust the exposure. Now, if you have an Android, it looks a little bit different. The first way is pretty similar. So on an Android, you're going to tap an object on the screen, and then it's a little bit harder to see in this video, but the sun is right here. And so you can either raise or lower the exposure using that sun. The second way on an Android, they hide their menu a little bit more on Android. So if you're using an Android, once you go into video mode, I'll pause it here for you. Let me back up. Down here on the bottom, you see this little menu that says More. You're going to want to click on that More menu if you have an Android. And then this video actually does flip the screen for you. And then you'll kind of get this large menu. You're going to click on this Pro on the top, and that Pro will open up a bunch of different controls for your camera. And you can see at the bottom where it says like ISO, speed, EV is the one we're talking about today. That's the exposure value. You can also adjust like white balance down here. So there's a lot of manual control settings that are hidden on a phone that like most people just point and shoot because the camera automatically adjusts for you and they don't know you can actually adjust some of your own settings if you want to. And so you're going to go to this EV exposure value and once you click it, you can kind of see on the bottom here where it, hang on, pops up and you're able to scroll through and choose your exposure value. It's that, I don't know if you can see it. It's being blocked by my Zoom control panel right now. But it's that little panel on the bottom where you can scroll through just like on the iPhone and choose the exact exposure value that you would like it to be set at. Okay. And so that is, it takes like 2 seconds once you learn how to do it on your phone, but it makes a huge difference and it makes editing a lot easier because your photos are instantly just a tiny bit brighter. And it's a lot easier to increase the exposure before you take the photo than accidentally like having to do it too much later in editing. Are there any questions about that tip before I move on to my very last tip for you, which we're going to talk about a little bit more about lighting? Okay. Then the last tip for you today, a lot of people ask about lighting and everyone is a little bit different. I personally only use artificial lighting. The reason being is that like I'm doing product photography multiple days a week for TpT authors. And a lot of times I'm working at night after my kiddos go to bed. In Minnesota, it's getting dark here at like, I don't know, 4:30, it feels like right now. Probably 5, but it is just crazy. So there's not really a lot of sunlight that is very consistent. So I just prefer my artificial lights. Sunlight is amazing if you have the flexibility to work around it. Um, Whatever light source you use, you really need it and want it to be spread as evenly and consistently across your resource as possible. That's going to make editing so much easier for you. And so my suggestion is to play around if you're finding that like one part of your photograph is a lot brighter than others, or you're having some really dark and shadowy parts. Playing around with the lighting, positioning, and angles can really help. And I give you a few examples here. And so if you picture this, this is my background layout of, this is my like mock-up of a background layout. The little rectangles here are like the pages of a resource. And I want you to picture this ring light. Let's say you're just using one ring light for photos. And if you put it, let's say, right behind your foam board, and I couldn't really get a picture that showed it facing like the right direction. But let's say I notice a lot of people will start with it where it is like 90 degrees. So your background is here and the ring light is facing up at a 90-degree angle, like at the back. This yellow kind of overlay shows you how that light kind of fades out. And so it might be really bright at the back of your photos, but you can kind of see it fade out and it's not as bright at the front. And if you only have that one light, that's not going to be very easy for you to edit. And I don't want to tell you you have to go out and buy a ton more lights. Like I do personally use a lot of lights because I'm doing this all the time and it does make it easier to get consistent lighting. But if you're just using one ring light, like there are other ways to do this. So this would be having it at the back. Then for example, if I had my ring light just at the front at that kind of 90-degree angle, you might see the front of your photo is really bright, but it starts to get a little bit more dark and shadowy by the time you kind of are reaching like the top of those resources or the back of your background. Here's what it might look like if you put it on the sides. And so what I suggest, and I'm pretending this yellow circle is my ring light. What I suggest is actually putting your ring light, and let me show you. I'm gonna kind of bring you over here. I think I'm gonna have to give me one moment. I'm gonna have to unblur my background here. There we go. So you can see how my ring light is above my background, and it is completely like parallel with my background. It's looking on top. Now I have a lot of other lights as well, but I think you're going to find if you're just using the one light, it usually works best above your resource like that. And then I'll show you on these different slides. So this is an example. If your ring light's too close to your resource, like in this image, you can see the ring light's pretty close and you can see that kind of yellow glow. It's really lighting up the middle, but around it, it's not quite as bright. So you might have one really bright spot, but around the edges, it's not getting spread far enough. So in this image, hopefully your brains are like following this. I was trying to make it so that I could actually, like, it's hard to explain sometimes setup without physically showing you. But what I did here was I took my ring light and tried to show you a diagram of what it might look like if you lifted it higher. And so you can see if you pull it, play around with pulling it up a little bit, yes, your light might not be quite as bright overall. Like you might have a really bright spot if it's close in the middle, but if you lift it higher, that spreads your light a little bit more evenly. And really what you want to go for, it's going to make editing a lot easier, is if your light's a little bit more even across your resource. And then you can see my little black on both of these. You can see my little black cutouts on top and bottom. I put those to remind myself that one of the things I do is you can actually, and I have a lot of people that have worked with me that like to do this, when you're using foam boards as your surface for taking photos on, some people will actually cut out like notches so that they can get their ring light closer to their resource, because they might notice that like their background, they don't need that much space for their resource. And they're like, sometimes the pole and the legs of the ring light are getting in the way from pushing it closer. So if you cut a little notch just in the back or in the front, it can help you scoot your pole in a little closer so that when you're tilting that ring light down, it's actually right above your resource. And it takes a little bit of playing around, but my suggestion is if you're playing around with your lights, just, move them, take a photo, look at it in your camera roll. And if you're like, oh yeah, I see some dark spots here, play around with that angle and position, because the more you like play around with it to figure it out, once you kind of have it down where it works best, then you'll know to put it there every time, if that makes sense. Okay. So those were just quick reminder of my 3 tips: DIY light box, increasing your exposure, and playing around with that lighting to get more even and consistent lighting. And that was all that I had for you as far as some quick tips for today, but I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.